Today, we delve into the curiously destructive species from the planet Earth. The professor's voice dripped with sarcasm. His large, luminous eyes scanned the room, briefly resting on each of the alien students before him. They hailed from every corner of the galaxy, tall, scaled beings from Hargan 9, delicate floating creatures from the gas planets of Urox, and even the hulking six-armed warriors of Thraxis. All were gathered in a state-of-the-art, spherical classroom that hovered mid-air, encased in a shimmering energy field. Holographic displays and streams of data floated around them, forming an impressive, immersive learning environment. Yet, when the subject of humans came up, most couldn't stifle a chuckle. Humans, one student, a towering figure with a translucent head full of shifting colors, scoffed. Weren't they still using combustion engines when the Galactic Union discovered them? Yes, the professor said with a hint of a smirk. Primitive, slow to advance in their early years, and deeply violent. But the Council has decided their history warrants our attention for the sake of completeness. He paused, activating a holographic display that projected Earth, a small, blue-green marble in the vast darkness of space. He zoomed in on a timeline of human development, showing crude stone tools evolving into basic weapons. For those unfamiliar, the humans have a unique obsession with conflict, often solving their problems by destroying one another. Odd, considering their short lifespans and fragile bodies. We're talking about a species that only began mastering flight just over a century before their planet-wide conflicts. A few generations, by our standards. The classroom rippled with amusement, low buzzing sounds of different species interpreting the professor's tone. A student from the floating race Urox raised a tentacle-like appendage. Why do we need to study them? Surely their wars can't compare to the conquests of Thraxis or the siege wars of the Taldorian moons. The professor waved his hand dismissively, eyes narrowing. Humans are persistent. Stubborn, perhaps. They lack the grandeur of galactic warfare but make up for it with sheer audacity. And we've been tasked with understanding them. He tapped another control, and a series of images flashed, humans in simple armor, crude swords in hand, fighting endless wars across a variety of terrains. They started with sticks and stones. Somehow, they managed to turn every tool they created into a weapon. From what I gather, it's less about the tools and more about the instinct. A chorus of low grumbles ran through the classroom. An elongated alien from the planet Zerissus grinned, displaying sharp fangs. I read they once destroyed entire cities with mere fire. Hardly a worthy subject for interstellar education. The professor smiled thinly. Indeed. And yet, the Council insists we study them because they survived. They thrived. No matter how close they came to extinction, they managed to claw their way back. Another student, this one from the Thraxis brood, chuckled. Survived themselves, you mean? It's a wonder they didn't wipe themselves out before the Galactic Union even noticed them. The room erupted into laughter, the kind that comes when a joke is shared across species. They couldn't fathom how a species so divided, so reckless, could be worth serious academic consideration. Unfazed, the professor let the laughter die down. He leaned forward, voice quieter but laced with something that bordered on intrigue. Oh, they came close. More than once. But that's where the humans surprise you. He clicked the display again, revealing an image of humans in modern military uniforms, standing amid the wreckage of battlefields, faces resolute, determined. The class went silent. You see, he said, with a tone that suggested he wasn't quite as dismissive as his words, human history is not just about war. It's about survival. It's about adaptation. And it's about pushing boundaries in ways no other species has. They may not seem impressive on the surface, but their methods? Worth studying, if only to understand how a species can be so resilient. There was a brief pause before he continued. Today's lesson will focus on their combat history. If nothing else, you might find it entertaining. A faint murmur passed through the class, skepticism lingering in the air. But the professor didn't wait for further objections. With a resigned sigh, he flicked a switch, launching the class into the depths of Earth's violent and complex history, starting with a single, ominous phrase. Let's begin. Humans began with the most basic tools, the professor started, flicking his hand as the holographic display showed crude figures wielding spears. Tribal warfare was their earliest form of conflict. Simple, really. One group of humans would fight another for resources, territory, or sometimes, no reason beyond a perceived insult. The alien students chuckled, shaking their heads. The primitive nature of early human combat seemed to further cement their belief in humanity's insignificance. Spears, an alien with scaled, spindly limbs asked, disbelief heavy in their tone. That's what they relied on? Sticks with sharpened ends? Yes, the professor nodded, not reacting to the condescension. And yet, these primitive weapons were effective. Humanity learned quickly that it wasn't always the weapon itself, but how it was used. Over time, they improved. Spears gave way to swords, bows, and slings. Their battles became more complex, with groups organizing into armies, and crude strategies developing. A hologram depicted an ancient battlefield, rows of soldiers clashing in chaotic yet purposeful lines. Shields locked, swords clanged against metal, and arrows rained from the sky. The students looked unimpressed, still hung up on the simplicity of the weapons. But this, the professor continued, is where humans began to show something unique. Their weapons were basic, their enemies often stronger or better equipped, yet they always seemed to adapt. When faced with a stronger opponent, they didn't back down. Instead, they found new ways to win. The display shifted, showing a smaller group of humans, outnumbered and poorly armed, taking on a larger army. Arrows whistled through the air, and the humans used the terrain to outmaneuver their enemies, trapping them in narrow passes or attacking from the high ground. Humanity developed tactics, ways to turn disadvantages into strengths. They fought the Mongols, an army unlike any they'd seen, and though many fell, they learned. Then the Romans came, legions of disciplined soldiers marching in perfect formation. But even against Rome's mighty war machine, some humans defied the odds and survived. Survived, one student repeated, incredulous. Against an empire? The professor smiled. Yes. Over and over again. They didn't just fight for conquest or glory. It was always more primal, survival. Every time they were defeated, they found a way to come back. A new strategy, a new weapon, a new approach. The holograms transitioned from swords and shields to images of early firearms, cannons blasting through fortifications, muskets held by determined infantrymen. The battlefield was no longer about mere physical strength, it was evolving. The tools had changed, but the instinct remained the same. With the discovery of gunpowder, the professor continued, humans quickly transformed warfare. No longer reliant on brute strength or close combat, they could kill from a distance. Cannons reduced cities to rubble, and muskets allowed even the weakest to become deadly. They were beginning to harness the true power of destruction. Several students shifted in their seats, no longer laughing. The weapons were still primitive by galactic standards, but the professor's tone had shifted, and they could sense there was more to this than simple tools. They fought against each other relentlessly, the professor said. Kingdoms rose and fell in the blink of an eye. Civilizations clashed, borders shifted, and still, humans adapted. They fought for dominance, but it was always survival at its core. Their ability to change, to evolve under pressure, that's what set them apart. The image shifted again, this time showing the aftermath of a battle. Smoke rose from the ruins of a once great city. Human soldiers, battered but unbroken, stood amid the devastation, their faces grim but defiant. Even when they lost, they learned, the professor continued. Each defeat brought new innovations. They didn't just adapt, they refined their craft. Humans are innovators, especially when it comes to conflict. They began with sticks, but soon they had cannons, guns, and tactics that no other species could anticipate. The class was silent now, their initial amusement fading. Some of the students, the more perceptive ones, were beginning to grasp what the professor was trying to convey. This wasn't just a history of primitive wars, it was a testament to human resilience, their capacity to survive and innovate under the harshest conditions. One student finally spoke, a tone of confusion mixed with curiosity. But, if their weapons were always inferior, how did they manage to keep winning? Surely superior forces would have wiped them out? One would think so, the professor replied, his voice thoughtful. But humanity has a curious ability to turn weakness into strength. They don't need to have the best weapons. They simply need to have the will to keep fighting. And that, dear students, is a lesson worth learning. The room remained quiet, the earlier laughter now replaced with contemplation. For the first time, the alien students were starting to realize that perhaps they had underestimated the humans. The holographic display flickered, and the images of spears and cannons faded, replaced by the grim, metallic clatter of industrialized warfare. The professor's voice dropped, the gravity of the subject palpable. By the early 20th century, humans had progressed far beyond swords and shields. Their wars had become something far more horrifying. The First World War. A conflict that spanned continents, involving millions of soldiers and civilians alike. It was unlike anything they had faced before. They called it, the war to end all wars, though they would be proven wrong soon enough. A massive battlefield unfolded on the display, trenches stretching as far as the eye could see, shrouded in fog and smoke. Soldiers crouched in mud-soaked trenches, clad in gas masks as artillery shells rained down. The students watched in silence, no longer mocking. The scale of the destruction, the ceaseless bombardment, it was unsettling even to those familiar with galactic warfare. World War I saw the introduction of industrialized warfare, the professor continued. Humans brought new machines into the fray, tanks, machine guns, airplanes. They fought not for days or weeks, but for years. The sheer brutality of trench warfare, where men were ground into the dirt for mere inches of land, was a new kind of horror. And when they realized guns and bombs weren't enough, they turned to chemical warfare. The scene shifted, showing clouds of mustard gas rolling over the trenches. Soldiers clutched at their throats, stumbling and falling. The alien students recoiled visibly, their complexions shifting, tentacles curling, and eyes narrowing at the sight of it. Poison gas, chemical agents designed not to kill outright, but to incapacitate, to suffocate, to blind. It was a weapon of terror. Humans didn't just seek victory, they sought to break each other in ways that left a mark deeper than death. There was a pause as the display transitioned to a desolate, crater-riddled landscape. Then, the professor's voice grew colder. But even this was merely a prelude to what was coming. The Second World War. The imagery changed again, the scale of destruction now incomprehensible. Cities reduced to rubble, vast columns of tanks advancing across Europe, planes darkening the skies. The students leaned forward, their previous disinterest replaced with genuine curiosity. They had seen battles before, but nothing like this. Nothing on this scale. By the time the Second World War began, humanity had learned to harness their machines of war to devastating effect. The entire world was drawn into the conflict. No species in our galaxy has ever engaged in something so all-consuming. They fought across every environment, oceans, deserts, jungles, cities. Armies in the tens of millions clashed in battles that spanned from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen streets of Stalingrad. The hologram zoomed in on Stalingrad, showing soldiers locked in brutal urban combat, fighting building by building, street by street. The professor's voice took on a more somber tone. Here, humans learned that victory could come not from strength alone, but from endurance. In Stalingrad, the city became a fortress, and both sides lost hundreds of thousands in a single battle. It became a test of willpower, who could outlast the other. The alien students exchanged uneasy glances. One finally spoke, a note of disbelief in their voice. How could they justify such losses? Entire cities turned to dust, millions dead, all for what? The professor's expression hardened. Survival. For humans, war had become not just about dominance, but about survival at any cost. As their enemies grew more advanced, so too did their desperation. The hologram transitioned again, this time showing the skies over Hiroshima, followed by the bright, blinding flash of a mushroom cloud rising over the city. The class fell utterly silent, the weight of what they were seeing slowly sinking in. And then, they did the unthinkable, the professor continued, his voice nearly a whisper now. They harnessed the power of the atom, creating a weapon capable of obliterating entire cities in an instant. The atomic bomb, dropped twice. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands incinerated in moments. And those who survived? They were left scarred, poisoned by radiation. The cost was unimaginable. One student, visibly shaken, muttered, "Why? Why would they go that far?" The professor fixed his eyes on the class, his voice steady but dark. Because they believed it was the only way to end the war. To stop the cycle of endless death. And it worked. Japan surrendered shortly after. But at what cost? Humanity had discovered a weapon that could erase them from existence, yet they didn't flinch from using it. The students sat in stunned silence. There were no more scoffs, no dismissive laughs. They stared at the destruction, realizing that this small, seemingly insignificant species had waged wars on a scale that made even their most violent galactic conflicts look like skirmishes. A student finally spoke, their voice tentative. "These humans, they don't fight to win, do they?" The professor nodded gravely. "No. They fight to survive. Even when survival means destroying everything around them, including themselves." The realization settled heavily over the room. The aliens had studied warfare before, seen great empires rise and fall across the stars. But this? This was something different. Humans, they now understood, were not driven by conquest alone. They were driven by a need to endure, no matter the cost, no matter how high the stakes. As the class continued, the alien students were no longer just observers. They were beginning to realize that the humans were a force unlike any they had encountered, fragile, yes, but with a spirit that refused to break, even when facing total destruction. The professor didn't pause for long before transitioning to the next chapter of human warfare. The holographic display shifted from the smoldering ruins of World War II to sleek, futuristic weaponry, drones soaring over battlefields, soldiers communicating through encrypted channels, satellites locking onto targets from orbit. After the horrors of the world wars, humanity faced a choice, the professor began, his tone more subdued now. To either annihilate themselves with their newfound weapons of mass destruction or to adapt once again. They chose adaptation. But this time, it was not just about building bigger bombs. It was about something far more sophisticated, modern warfare. A drone buzzed across the display, sending live video feedback to a command center miles away. This, the professor pointed, is a modern military drone. Unmanned, precise, and lethal from thousands of kilometers away. No longer do humans need to risk their lives on the front lines. They can wage war from the safety of a command center. The students shifted uneasily. This level of detachment from the battlefield was alien to them. To fight without direct physical engagement, it was a level of war they hadn't anticipated. But the professor wasn't done. And then there's cyber warfare. The hologram flickered, showing streams of code, firewalls breaking down, and digital infrastructures collapsing. Humans learned that battles need not be fought with bombs or bullets. Instead, entire nations can be crippled with nothing more than keystrokes. They can disrupt communications, drain resources, or even turn an enemy's own weapons against them, all from behind a computer screen. One student raised a limb, clearly perplexed. "So, their wars are fought by machines now?" The professor tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the partial truth. "Not entirely. Humans still put their soldiers on the ground when necessary. But they've evolved beyond just brute force. They use their machines and their technology to manipulate the battlefield. Information has become as valuable as firepower." The display shifted again, showing satellite imagery and encrypted military communications. They gather intelligence, satellite feeds, drones, even data stolen from their enemies. Every move is calculated. Each decision is based on layers of information. It's no longer just about who has the biggest army or the strongest weapons. It's about who knows more. Who can outthink their opponent. The hologram zoomed in on a battlefield, revealing a small squad of human soldiers using advanced technology to move swiftly and efficiently through enemy territory, their movements guided by real-time intelligence. The professor's voice grew more analytical, almost impressed. In the Vietnam War, for instance, the humans faced an enemy that knew the land far better than they did. Their technology wasn't enough to secure a swift victory. So they adapted again, learning guerrilla tactics and psychological operations to destabilize their opponent. The students listened intently now, their previous skepticism replaced by intrigue. Modern humans had clearly moved far beyond the primitive warfare they dismissed earlier. This was no longer just about weapons, it was about the mind, about strategy. In the Gulf Wars and the more recent conflicts in Ukraine, humans didn't just rely on superior firepower, the professor continued. They relied on precision, on communication, and on psychological operations. They mastered the art of disinformation, turning public opinion against their enemies before even setting foot on the battlefield. The professor's words hung in the air for a moment, allowing the gravity of human warfare to settle over the class. In modern times, they've taken warfare beyond Earth itself. Satellites in space, surveillance from orbit, and yes, plans for militarized operations beyond their own atmosphere. They've even used space as a tactical asset, disrupting enemy communications from above, weaponizing intelligence in a way no one saw coming. The class remained silent. The leaps in technology were undeniable, but what astonished them most was how quickly humanity had advanced. In just a few decades, they'd gone from the chaos of World War II to the controlled, calculated precision of modern combat. It was a pace unmatched by any other species in the galaxy. And then there's artificial intelligence, the professor added, his tone darker now. Humans are beginning to incorporate AI into their weapons. Drones that can make decisions autonomously, cyber weapons that evolve and adapt during attacks. The battlefield is no longer about human strength or endurance. It's about who can outmaneuver the other's machines and strategies. The human mind has become their greatest weapon, using technology as an extension of their will. The room was now filled with a quiet sense of awe. No longer were the alien students dismissing Earth's history. They were beginning to realize that humans, while fragile and short-lived, possessed a relentless drive to overcome any obstacle, to outthink and outmaneuver enemies far more advanced than they were. One of the students spoke up, a tone of newfound respect in their voice. So, they don't just fight. They plan. They adapt. They evolve. The professor nodded slowly. Exactly. They are not the strongest, nor the most advanced. But they are survivors. They think, they strategize, they innovate. When they can't win with brute force, they change the game entirely. Another student, visibly shaken, asked, even when outmatched? Especially when outmatched, the professor responded. That's when they're at their most dangerous. And that, class, is what makes them unique. They don't stop at just surviving. They learn, they adapt, and then they find a way to win. There was no laughter now, no dismissive glances. The students had begun to understand what made humanity formidable. Their wars weren't just battles of strength, they were battles of wits, of innovation, of willpower. The realization that even in the face of superior enemies, humanity would find a way, left the room heavy with contemplation. The room fell into a heavy silence as the last holographic image faded away. No one spoke. The once dismissive glances and laughter were gone, replaced by something far deeper, respect, awe, perhaps even a hint of fear. The professor, visibly unsettled himself, stood in front of the class, his usual air of superiority shaken. He glanced at the notes on his device, but for the first time in the entire course, he hesitated. His voice, when it finally returned, had lost its previous dismissiveness. And so, that is the combat history of humanity. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. As you've seen, humans are complex. They fight not only with their bodies but with their minds, their technology, and their very will to survive. Throughout their history, they've been both the architects of unimaginable destruction and the pioneers of astonishing progress. The professor paused, almost as if he were reconsidering everything he'd just taught. He had intended to portray humanity as a primitive, war-hungry species, but the weight of their history now loomed over him as well. His fingers hovered over the control panel, but he didn't seem eager to close the lesson just yet. They've created weapons that could end their entire species, and yet they continue to live. They've fought wars so devastating that most other civilizations would have torn themselves apart long ago. He shook his head, still unable to fully comprehend it. But somehow, they endure. One of the students finally broke the silence, their voice hesitant, filled with uncertainty. Professor, how did they survive themselves? How does a species that causes so much destruction not collapse under the weight of its own wars? The professor looked up, meeting the student's gaze. He opened his mouth as if to give an answer, but no simple response came. He faltered, his mind racing. That, he began, is not an easy question to answer. He took a breath, searching for the right words. Humans, they seem to live in constant conflict, if not with others, then with themselves. But perhaps that's why they've survived. Each generation of humans faces new challenges, new enemies, often of their own making. And yet, in every conflict, they push their limits, they innovate, they adapt. That's their nature. In every moment of destruction, they somehow find the seeds of progress. The alien students remained silent, their expressions contemplative. The mocking they'd shown earlier was long gone. One by one, their preconceived notions of humanity had been dismantled. What they'd learned today wasn't just about war, it was about a species that had thrived in the crucible of its own chaos. They are unlike any species we've encountered, the professor admitted, his tone now respectful. Not because they are the oldest or the strongest, but because they are survivors. They are an elder race not by age, but by experience. No other species has faced such constant self-destruction and emerged stronger each time. The room remained still, the weight of the lesson pressing down on everyone present. One student, in a voice barely above a whisper, offered the final thought. So, they don't seek conflict. But when conflict finds them, they become something else. Something more. The professor nodded solemnly. Yes. And that is what makes them both terrifying and admirable. The class ended in silence, but it wasn't the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of realization. Each student left the room with a profound new understanding of humanity. They weren't just a blip in the galactic history they'd come to study. They were a force, a species unlike any other in the galaxy, driven, relentless, and ever-evolving.